Good morning, or evening, or whatever time of day it is in your world. Today, we are going to do the second video for the unit on development and aging. All right, and we're going to today we're going to go from the that first week from pre-embryonic development all the way up until the point of birth. So. Um, in the first week after fertilization and before the fertilized egg actually makes its way through the oviducts and reaches the uterus, a couple of things are going on. All right, during this time, remember, the mother is not technically pregnant. So during this point, right after fertilization, we go through the process of cleavage. All right, and we talked about this in the last video. This is simply a cell division where you start out with one cell that's this big and then end up with multiple cells that are still this big. So the cell number increases, but the individual cell size is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the reason for that is that there's no connection between the baby and mom, and therefore no growth can occur. By the end of this period, we have a ball of cells that we refer to as a morula. The morula is again not really implanted, so the mom is not pregnant. But eventually, that morula starts to hollow out. And it becomes what we call a blastula or a blastocyst. And that early blastocyst is a hollow ball of cells, and inside of that hollow ball is another mass of cells, an inner mass that actually eventually will become the baby. The outer mass of cells is what we call the chorion, and we talked about the chorion yesterday or in the last video as well. Finally, at the end of that first week, we go through implantation, where the early blastocyst reaches the uterus and essentially buries itself in the wall of the mother's uterus. Okay, so this is what it kind of looks like. This is more of a time lapse kind of thing as opposed to an all the time. All right, the egg is out of been ovulated and is up in the oviducts. Eventually, it will become fertilized, and that's represented up here. You can see multiple sperm are trying to dig through the corona radiata and the zona pellucida, but one lucky sperm will enter. And then eventually those two nuclei, one from the sperm and one from the egg, will fuse to form the zygote. All right, and that's represented here. We then undergo the first step of cleavage, then the second step of cleavage, then the third step of cleavage, and so on, until eventually we have this solid ball of cells called the morula. Now, around this time, we're entering the uterus, and this is like day 4, 5, maybe 6. And the morula hollows itself out, and you can see the hollow ball right here. And this inner mass, the blue mass, is what's going to eventually become the baby. And the outer mass that you see here is going to eventually become the chorion. And you can see this all ends in implantation, with the fetus implanting itself in the uterine wall. Now, this, my friends, is your baby picture, all right, or at least an artist's rendition of what you look like after that first week of development. So during week 2, mom is well and truly pregnant, okay? Implantation has occurred, and now a little bit of morphogenesis and differentiation begins to occur. The embryo is shown in blue right here. And we have the yolk sac. The chorion is shown here. This is the amniotic cavity. And I think that's all we got for now. At this point, the uterus begins to secrete a hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. And what this does is it maintains the corpus luteum. Remember, the corpus luteum in the ovary, the scar tissue in the ovary from where the follicle burst through, is releasing progesterone. And the progesterone keeps the endometrium in the uterus from being shed, and so that mom no longer will go through her monthly cycle. HCG, by the way, is the basis for most market-based pregnancy tests. The ones that, the mom pees on the stick and it says positive or negative. That's what they're looking for. Eventually, whoopsie daisy, the inner cell mass detaches and becomes what we call the embryonic disc. And I circled that earlier, crying out loud, circled that earlier. And this will begin to develop into what we call a gastrula, for crying out loud. All right. And so gastrulation forms the three primary germ layers: the endoderm, which is the innermost layer, the mesoderm, which is the middle layer, and the ectoderm, which is the outermost layer. The ectoderm will eventually become things like the skin and the nervous system. The mesoderm will become muscles and the internal organs. And finally, the endoderm will become the digestive tract. Okay. Week 3, you can see you now look like a worm. A long, thin structure shown here in this picture in blue. The yolk sac has gotten a little bit smaller, and the allantois has begun to develop. You can see here that the chorion, this layer in here, has started to push out finger-like projections into the placenta so that there can be an exchange of oxygen and nutrients and carbon dioxide and all the other stuff. At this point, the nervous system has begun to develop, and there's a neural tube which will become the spinal cord and the brain. And also during week 3, the cardiovascular system begins to develop, and so we have the first signs of a heart occurring here. During weeks 4 and 5, growth continues. You can see the embryo itself is getting longer and longer from week 4 over here to week 5 over here. The embryo itself is a little bit bigger than a font size 12 print in a textbook or on a paper. The chorionic villi form and begin to really, crying out loud, really make their way into the tissue of the placenta from the mom. Limb buds begin to form, all right, which will eventually become your arms and your legs. The umbilical cord forms, all right. You can see it beginning to form here, and then certainly it's formed right here. At week 5, you can see there's a large enlargement of the head because the nervous system is really taken off here. And at that point, you can actually see eyes and ears and nose, or at least where they are developing. At week 5, this is your baby picture. On the left, you have a photograph of a 5-week-old embryo. And on the right is a picture, a cartoon of what that might look like. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out here. The brain is highly developed, very thick, but we have an eye, an optic vesicle, which will eventually become the eye. You also have what's called a pharyngeal pouch here. And this is essentially the same kind of structure as a gill that you would find in a fish and some kind of salamanders. All right. There's an old saying in developmental biology that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's just a fancy way of saying that as an embryo develops, it kind of goes through some of the evolutionary stages that animals went through over the course of many millions of years. You've got the heart located here. The liver has begun to form. And of course, the nervous system goes all the way down, right through, and notice a tail. All right, you've got a tail here. All right, here's your legs, here and here. And then there's a little bit of a tail beyond that. These little white things are called somites. They will eventually develop into your vertebrae, all right, the bones of the vertebrae. And then, of course, last but not least, you've got the umbilical cord, which is connected to the placenta, which is attached to mom. Okay, So between a month and a half and 2 months of age, the embryo begins to look like a human being. Reflex actions begin to occur, so the embryo is moving. It's only about an inch and a half long, so maybe that big. Um, and all of the major organ systems have been established. So you've got digestive system, cardiovascular, nervous, excretory, and so on. At this point, the embryo is about 38 millimeters in length and weighs about the same as an aspirin tablet. So think about that. Hold an aspirin in your hand. That's how much you weigh at the end of 2 months of development. Okay. During the third and fourth month here, you begin to grow hair. The head begins to slow down in terms of its growth, and the body actually begins to catch up. Ossification occurs in the skeleton, so the cartilage blueprint that was originally laid down is starting to be replaced by bony tissue. If the distinction between male and female becomes physically apparent at this point. Remember, your gender is determined at the moment of conception, whether you get an X chromosome or a Y chromosome from your dad. But physically, at about the third month, you can figure out by looking at the embryo whether it's got male parts or female parts. At the end of month 4, heartbeats can be heard using a stethoscope. So a doctor or nurse, someone listening, can hear the fetal heartbeat. And at the end of this period, we've got a baby who is about 6 inches long and weighs about 6 ounces, so still less than half a pound. Now, the one thing I do want to point out is this word fetal. All right, there's really no scientific distinction, no magic point where we go from being an embryo to being a fetus. Typically, in the first 2 months of pregnancy, we refer to the developing offspring as an embryo. And then from the beginning of the third month right through birth, we refer to it as a fetus. But it's not like there's, some little baby fairy comes down and waves a wand and turns you into a fetus from an embryo at some magical point. Fetal development by between the 5th and the 7th month, fetal movement can be detected by mom. All right, putting her hands on her belly, she can feel the baby kick and that sort of thing. The baby is in the fetal position, as is illustrated in the picture that you see here on the right-hand side. The eyes are open or can open, and the baby has increased to about 12 inches long, so about a foot long, and it weighs about 3 pounds. Now, just as a little piece of trivia, this is pretty close to what the triplets looked like when they were born. They were born at 29 and a half weeks, which is just over 7 months of development. And so they were a little bit bigger than this, a little bit more developed, I should say. Each one was somewhere around 15 inches long. And they weighed not quite 2.5 pounds. But again, there were 3 of them in there. So they were a little smaller than a singleton might be. They were at birth at 29 and a half weeks. They were 2 pounds 5 ounces, 2 pounds 7 ounces, and 2 pounds 9 ounces in weight. So there are singletons who weighed more than all 3 babies put together. But this is what they look like. All right, little monsters from outer space. Okay, fetal development in months 8 and 9. Weight gain is about a pound per week. The fetus, toward the end of the last month, the fetus rotates so that the head is pointed downward toward the cervix. And at the end of this, an average American baby will weigh about 7.5 pounds and be approximately 20 inches long. Just for your information, on the night of the triplets' birth, I took my wedding ring off and put it on my daughter's wrist. All right, so think about how big your ring finger is, or my ring finger is. That's how big her arm was. So very, 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 very tiny at that point. And then moving into the 8th and 9th month, inside the womb they'll grow. And of course, my kids grew in incubators. Okay, so that is the end of our second slideshow on development and aging. Stay tuned for the third and final one, and I will post these all very shortly. All right.